Well, let me raise the elephant in the room. So this, and I think you mentioned labor, and this requires politically difficult conversations, collective bargaining conversations. Do you have any thoughts on, when you're talking about a longer school day, a longer school year, some of these ideas that you're talking about are big ticket items and they require changes to the teacher union contract. Can you talk about how devastating a strike or a threat of a strike, or how would that, how could a new mayor and new CEO successfully bargain for that?
So there are examples across the country of where labor and management have come together and actually tried to get some new things done. Boston created pilot schools. Pilots were in-district charters with support from labor. They gave them flexibility over hiring and firing, use of money, people, time, governance, policy. All of it was very charter-like. And those schools performed well over time. So that was a result of having an external threat called charters coming from the state to the local city, and the union saying to me then, well, let's come up with an alternative, and us coming up with an alternative and growing it. So it doesn't have to be all, in my view, it doesn't have to be all oppositional. I think charters are an important part of that because they do create some exogenous threat, which is a necessary force to get people to the table in a different way.
Yeah, I think that oftentimes charter schools are seen as a threat, but I think the response that we've seen in Chicago to that threat has not been the response that you witnessed in Boston. I think the response that we've seen has been much more combative as opposed to, let's see. So I have a major in international affairs from Georgetown, so I'm trying to be as diplomatic as I possibly can. I'm trying to remember everything that I learned back then. It's just been too combative. It's been too, us against them, and I don't think that's going to change, frankly. I don't think we're going to see the Chicago Teachers Union say, okay, now we understand and embrace charters in this way, and now we're going to improve what we're doing in response to that. With that said, however, I do think there are opportunities for, and this is again why, who the new mayor is so important, and where a mayor can really demonstrate leadership on this front. I think there's an opportunity for the mayor to present to the city, these are our goals for education, this is what we want to do, and we know that every teacher out there wants success for their children and wants to be the best possible teacher. We're going to put supports in place to support teachers, but here are the goals, and we're all going to move towards those goals. And some of those goals include lengthening the school day, and we're going to have to figure out a way as teachers, how we're going to be willing to agree to that, how we're going to say that's something that makes sense. Look at the data, look at the points, and we're going to do it. I think that we'll see changes like that with the right type of leadership in the mayor's office and in the CEO position within the Chicago Teachers Union. But I don't think we're going to see a major shift where we'll see this big, embracing of charter schools by the unions. But I do think that these types of changes are possible, and I think the folks are reasonable and open to them.
Let me just say that, because there's one element, this notion of the union will always be combative, that worries me a little bit, right? So let me separate two things. I don't think there's any, in my mind, there's no doubt that the great victory of the charter movement nationally has not been what they've done directly for the students in those schools, which has been excellent sometimes and then so-so other times. The great victory of the national charter school movement has been what it has done to the union movement, right? I have had two different vice presidents of UFT tell me that they have backed off their formerly aggressive defense of mediocre and ineffective teachers because of the fear of the boogeyman of charter schools, right? That one thing, I think, has changed enormously the possibilities on the national landscape. At the Chicago level, what I will say that I have great confidence, with great confidence, is that the current leadership, I want to say nothing at all about past CTU leadership, the current leadership of CTU has an educational agenda, right? I'm not sure when that has been true in this city in the past. Does that mean they will not be combative? Does that mean that they will willingly give up gains that their predecessors have won? No. But it means that there is a possibility for a kind of discussion with current union leadership that we may miss if we see them in the same light in which we looked at previous union leadership, right? So that, yes, this is not going to be easy. Mass change, so far as I can, is absolutely predicated on the ability of principals to control staffs, and that means you've got to be able to move out the folk at the bottom and groom the folk at the top. Unions, no matter how you operationalize that, it's not easy for unions to accept, right? Yes, there will be fights. We should not continue to look at the union as the enemy.
Oh, I agree.
And that's probably too.
Right. And when I'm talking about it being combative, I'm talking about the CTU specifically as it relates to charter schools, specifically in Chicago. So, you know, the head of the Chicago Teachers Union recently said at the Chicago Board of Education meeting that charter schools were a big marketing scheme. That's combative language. So I don't think that that's going to change. However, I do believe that and I think you're right, and this goes back to kind of the original promise of charter schools, which is let's create these small islands of experimentation, if you will, and let's see how they do, and then let's take that and apply it broadly, which, by the way, is something else that I think the new mayor and CEO can do. They can look at what's working currently in the city of Chicago, whether it be in traditional or charter or magnet schools, and say, now how do we apply this more broadly? I think the same thing is in fact happening with the unions, particularly with the Chicago Teachers Union. I do think that folks are saying, you know, this issue of longer school day is a real issue, yes, and we need to figure out how we can address it. So the only thing that when I'm saying that when I bring up the point about being combative, I really think it's a charter school CTU thing, and that's basically because by law, Chicago Teachers Union cannot organize within charter schools. So I think that natural combativeness is always going to be there.
Just one other point quickly on this one. There was a front page article in the New York Times today about governors pushing on these issues, particularly these issues of teacher tenure. So there's a level of embrace in the national discourse, political discourse here for real movement. There's state level embrace here in Illinois, which really is bipartisan that we've seen evidence of. I think the missing lever, in addition to some external threats, because I think those are inevitable, they're necessary. The missing lever is sort of the greatest untapped source of leverage in this enterprise is parents, and in my view, and whether there could be this level of demand for whatever the form of school, charter, turnaround, close a bad one, but contract. Mayor Daley has created some space in Chicago, which is pretty remarkable for different forms of new school development. But what really needs work is to build the community level demand for a higher quality and the systems where parents can choose the schools that they really want to attend.
I would just add, it's not just about the parents demanding choices. I think you're absolutely right. Parents are too often left out of this equation. It's the district and the union negotiating the contract. And it's very arcane. It's very bureaucratic, inside baseball negotiations that happen. But they need to be part of the public conversation. And parents, I don't think, we as sort of stakeholders in this have not done a good enough job of getting information into the hands of parents, particularly on the school day, school year issue. People are sort of becoming dimly aware of the fact that we have a short school day and school year, but they're not connecting the dots and realizing that we also have, again, as I said before, some of the highest salaries in the country. And so I think if parents understood just how short our school day and school year are, and also that as taxpayers and parents that they're paying top dollar, there might be a different demand around the next negotiation of the contract, but that kind of information sharing has to be done over time, starting, May 16th.
So that's interesting, Gretchen. The whole issue of parent engagement, which always has been cited as sort of the holy grail of education that I don't think government has figured out how to effectively cultivate. But Tim, I would be, and Charles too, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on where have there been really effective examples of meaningful parent engagement, where parents become true advocates for their child's education.
Well, I think there are plenty of examples in the city of Chicago and nationally. I think that I'm conflicted on this particular issue because I recognize the importance of parental engagement and the benefit that it can have to a child's education and a child's success. I think everyone understands and agrees with that. The reason I'm conflicted is because the population I'm dealing with, and I think this is the case with Tim and the University of Chicago's charter schools, tend to be very poor, and the parents tend to be very young. And in many ways, they are children having children. And I believe that while we do everything we can to engage parents, we have cell phones for all the adults in the building, and the parents and the teachers have those, and the parents and the students have those cell phone numbers and call us all the time. We have events, we have education programs, we do all of that. The reality is, in my experience, that parents are often unable to engage in a way that will really, really benefit the child. And so they rely heavily on the school to step in and step up and fill that role. That's not to say we don't want, celebrate, and encourage parental engagement. I want to make that perfectly clear. We do, and that's important. But I think that schools have to recognize that they have to, in many instances, particularly in urban centers like Chicago, do more than just be the schoolhouse and the teacher who has the child for 6 hours a day, but really has to go above and beyond and step in and step up where a parent may not be able to. So I think parental engagement is important. We should encourage it. I think there are creative ways around the city and country where it's happening, but at the same time, I think we have to also make sure that our teachers and administrators within our schools have the supports necessary to bring to bear the full resources of this city on each and every child when a parent may not be there to provide them.
You know, it's interesting, when you ask that question around the country in other cities, people will say, oh, you should go to Logan Square in Chicago. They're the ones who do parents right? The Logan Square Neighborhood Association has had what they call their parent mentor program. It must be in the 10-year-old range, something like that. The figure that sticks in my head is that they have sent 1,300 parents from that one neighborhood through their training. The training involves anything that develops the parent, but also anything that parents can do to help the child. It's been a remarkable success, and I'm just commenting on the irony that it's often, the prophet is not honored at home. It gets more attention elsewhere than here. Part of my work now is taking what Tim has learned in the University of Chicago charter schools and trying to translate that into the public schools of Woodlawn. And one of the ideas that we are trying to develop in Woodlawn is a Woodlawn version of what Logan Square is doing. It's just gotten off the ground, but to connect to the point about parents and information, we are learning it's not only important, and CPS have been very good about giving our parents access to data that parents have not had access before about their school. What we've learned just in the last few months is that that's not enough. What there is real power in is parents having comparative data about schools in their neighborhood. Among our schools in Woodlawn, 2 are performing at a much higher level than everybody else. And in fact, one of them is going to get an award today, and that's going to lead to more conversation among our parents. Because our parents now have an active discourse about if Woodlawn and Dumont can do this, why can't our schools do this, right? And it's wonderful to watch this discourse develop, but it's being driven by giving parents more comparative information.
Just one thought. I think there's a huge disconnect, and I think I'm underscoring, Tim, something you were saying, between educators sort of using the rhetoric of parent involvement and actually acting on it.
Right.
And the consortium, our applied research group, has done a pretty remarkable book, 5 colleagues, that says there are 5 things you have to do well if you want to make substantial improvement in truly disadvantaged schools in Chicago. And they've got 15 years of evidence that support doing those 5 things well. If you do 3 of the 5, you're 10 times more likely to make substantial improvement. 10 times, and 30 times less likely to stagnate. One of those things is engage the parents and the community. So the point here is, I think your point, Tim, that we have to figure out ways not just to communicate to parents better, but to actually persuade teachers, teacher leaders, school leaders that this will actually play to their benefit if they do it in a systematic way. What I'm not optimistic about, and I'm sure Charles will likely disagree, I haven't seen a lot of evidence of districts actually figuring out the parent engagement piece. Schools do it, and when they do it well, it's remarkable. Districts have tried in many forms and fashions to do this, but they, at least in my view, haven't crossed the Rubicon.
I will take advantage of my having a mic and it being on to give a shout out to early education here, where it really, it's when parents are most open to hearing suggestions about parenting skills and education about what are developmentally appropriate activities, where I think is a great opportunity to start engaging parents early and making them lifelong advocates for their kids' education. We don't look at that. We look at it just within the K-12 space, and we need to look at it starting earlier than that.